Hey everybody, this is Harvey, and today we're up here in New York City. And what we're going to be doing on today's episode and in this series is exploring some of the roots and inspirations for me as a musician, as a journalist, as an activist. And we're exploring some of the hidden history of one of my biggest inspirations, Woody Guthrie, perhaps America's most famous folk singer and the author of perhaps one of America's most famous songs, This Land Is Your Land.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, from the California to the New York Island.
So last year I was lucky enough to be put in touch with Woody's daughter, Nora Guthrie, and we actually worked on a song together that became Old Man Trump.
Beach Haven is Trump's town, where the old black folks come to roam. No, no, Old Man Trump, old Beach Haven ain't my home.
The words were written by Woody Guthrie in the early 1950s when he was living in a building called Beach Haven, owned by Donald Trump's infamous racist landlord father, Fred Trump. So those lyrics became the song. Me and Nora edited it, and part of the reason I've traveled up here today is to talk to Nora about Woody's life and especially about Woody's politics.
And I heard that all those mining people in Calumet, Michigan voted for Trump. That hurt.
So let's talk about the Old Man Trump song. So obviously we co-edited these lyrics together that Woody had written. It was never one complete song. We found a few. But tell me, so you kind of knew of the existence that some of these lyrics were out there.
After working with Woody's lyrics for 20-something years now, I'm not surprised, actually, because this has been a recurring thing. It just seems like every time something's going on in the country, somebody discovers a Woody lyric or remembers a Woody article or something, because he wrote so much and he wrote about everything from A to Z that it's, you can almost like have a, you know, like a Rolodex. Like, what did he say about Cheney? I'm sure he said something about vice presidents, you know,
or his grandfather, or
something, something like that. So I wasn't like totally surprised. I was pleasantly surprised, because it's nice to have something on the record that ties together this history.
I remember the first book I read front to back after leaving high school was A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And I realized that I was obsessed with history. And I read later, much later, after I had become a folk musician, that Howard Zinn, one of the reasons he cited as studying history when he got back from the Second World War was that he heard the Ludlow Massacre by Woody Guthrie.
It was early springtime and the strike was on.
And he thought to himself, I never heard of that massacre. I never learned about that in school. And he learned about it from a folk song. That it communicates to people in a certain way. It's a very raw way of performing, and it can be a very honest way of performing. There's really nothing you can hide behind when you're playing folk music.
And I grew up not too far away from him in Queens, in New York, where he grew up as a kid. Where Trump grew up. I know these guys. They were on my street. I know these guys. And so a lot of times he'll say things that I can hear in the back of my mind a kid on the block saying in the 1950s. What's surprising is that he hasn't changed the line since then.
Hi, I'm Tom Morello, and I'm standing up against Old Man Trump. Because when it comes to race relations, he's like an old school segregationist. When it comes to foreign policy, he's like an old school napalmist. When it comes to women's issues, he's like a frat house rapist. So let's not elect that guy, and I want you to stand up against Old Man Trump too. Not just him, but the history that he represents and the policies that he put forward. I'm standing up against Old Man Trump.
Seems to be in this kind of bubble of his family, real estate, as if that's America. That's what is amazing to me. He grew up in an ivory tower, a New York ivory tower, and to him, being an American was being a capitalist. That is his definition of democracy. no one taught him the difference between democracy as a political way of living and capitalism, which is an economic tool or definition. So because he grew up with a capitalist family, well, that was number one, basically. And democracy, if it could help, that would be nice.
Right, if it's convenient.
In 1949, a group called the Weavers, which was kind of the first folk music group, they predated Peter, Paul, and Mary and the Kingston Trio, etc. And the Weavers were a group of friends of my dad's. And so they had a big hit with the first folk song, which was Tzena Tzena, which is an Israeli folk tune. And then when they made the second record, they put So Long It's Been Good to Know You on the record, which my father wrote. So we got royalties from that. And with the royalties, we were able to move out of our little apartment in Coney Island to this bigger apartment in Beach Haven. Of course, as a little child, I didn't think anything was wrong, and it wasn't until many years later, when Will Kaufman did the research, that I realized that it was a segregated community. Now, evidently my father realized that way before I did, because that's what he wrote about, and he didn't know when he was moving in there that it was a segregated community. And he flipped out basically when he found out.
So here we are in Coney Island at Beach Haven, now luxury apartments, and back in the early 1950s when Woody Guthrie moved in here, this whole place was owned by Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump. Woody Guthrie, when he was living here in 1950, 1951, was very angry at his landlord, Fred Trump, and he had written about his racism, his segregationist policies, and just being a slumlord. Among other things, Fred Trump was arrested in 1927 for participating in a Ku Klux Klan riot in Queens, in which 1,000 KKK members attacked the police. And in 1970, 20 years after Woody wrote these lyrics about him, he was sued by the Justice Department for refusing to rent rooms to black people.
He wrote a couple of songs, and at one point, you know, he was developing Huntington's disease during these years. My mother started realizing that this was getting dangerous, and then at that time, he went and was officially diagnosed with Huntington's disease by a doctor. And at that point, my mother was advised to leave him because it would be too dangerous for the kids. She couldn't afford to keep the apartment then. So she wrote to the landlord asking to be let out. I think we had a 3-year lease, asking to be let out of the lease. And she writes this very nice letter, which is in the Woody Guthrie archives, explaining her situation. She said, I have 3 young children. My husband was just diagnosed with a fatal disease for which there is no cure or help. We're going to have to vacate the apartment because I can't pay the rent on my own. And she got, they were rejected. So we had to leave the apartment anyway, and
just pay the Trump family.
Lost the down payment and couldn't break the lease.
Beach Haven ain't my home, no, I just can't pay this rent. My money's down the drain and my soul is badly bent. Beach Haven is Trump's town when old black folks come to roam. No, old man Trump, old Beach Haven ain't my home.
Something that strikes me about and part of the reason I wanted to approach that song is because there's something so kind of quintessentially American about Donald Trump's story, about Woody Guthrie's story, right? And especially that these two, you know, people say there's 2 Americas, right? I think there's like way more than that. There's so many different characteristics and demographics that define your experience in this country's history. If you're African American, are you white, your class status, where you're from, you know, all these things, the era you grew up in, and you know, both of them come out of a similar era, but we're on very different sides.
You know, I think Woody Guthrie really, the reason that he became such a folkloric icon is because his songs captured a part of the United States during a really formative time of the United States, during the Great Depression, at a time when communism and socialism were very popular ideas here, at a time when fascism was becoming a popular idea here and across the world. Woody Guthrie is best known as the Dust Bowl Balladeer and Stories from Oklahoma and sort of Middle America. But he spent a lot of time in New York City. He actually arrived here in 1940 after hitchhiking across the country. And it was right here on the corner of 43rd and 6th Avenue where Woody wrote his most famous song, This Land Is Your Land. It's a hotel, and this is where Woody Guthrie lived when he came to New York, February 1940. Famously, 1 week after arriving here, he wrote This Land Is Your Land. Some people say it was a response to the song God Bless America, kind of an alternative anthem of a sort. And Woody had been traveling, he had hitchhiked across the country, and he had seen a lot of the country, as he had before. So it was kind of fresh on his mind coming here. Something about that song that I think is really interesting right now in this current point in American history is that song was written in 1940, and when you know that history and its relationship with God Bless America, you have these two competing narratives of what this country is and what it means, and obviously there's more narratives than that. But Woody was attempting to capture the Depression era America, the rural socialist America, and you know, sort of this vision of what it could be. Whereas, you know, here we are today competing with those same narratives, you know, like, is this a country that welcomes immigrants and refugees and migrants, or is it one that doesn't? Is it a country that looks at breaking down borders, or looks at building borders and walls, you know? And at its heart, that's what that song was about. Unfortunately, and quite intentionally, it's been misrepresented throughout history. And it was written right here in what is now a high-end piano store.
You know, the irony that Michigan the Electoral College Michigan went for Trump just hurt me to the core, because these are the people that my father loved. You know, like I was talking about the people from Oklahoma, that he wrote songs because he loved that uncle that worked in the mine, you know, that family that lost a grandmother in the mine at the party.
And this is something we were talking about earlier, that you know, Woody Guthrie's story gets simplified by a lot of, I would say, pop culture sort of knowledge of him, right? And for me, he represents, among many things, this forgotten rural left-wing voice in American history. And one of the things that's so ironic when you have somebody like Donald Trump who speaks as if he's addressing the rural poor, and you know, and he's not from the rural poor. He doesn't know this lifestyle. He's completely making it up. But there has been clearly a strategic focus of right-wing politicians on basically convincing rural America that their stories are tied together, that they really represent them. And then Woody Guthrie's voice is coming out of this whole other place, being like, you know.
Listen, people get hoodwinked by snake charmers all the time. It's not like this is a human nature story in a way. And you just saw a whole bunch of people just got hoodwinked. This has to play out. And in a way, one could say this is how people learn. This is how education happens through experience, not through reading a book or hearing somebody talk on the radio. It really happens through experience. Things get to a certain point and then they start to change.
So here we are at 37th Street in the Boardwalk, Coney Island. Right behind me here on the beach, this is where Woody Guthrie's family spread his ashes after his death. But as we know, Woody's legacy is spread throughout the world and throughout this country through his songs and his stories. As we heard today in the episode from myself, from Nora Guthrie, from activists in New York, we're facing really hard times right now. And we're dealing with a lot of the same situations that Woody Guthrie dealt with in his lifetime, along with so many others. Whether it's the exploitation of workers or the plague of racism. So it'll be important for us in these times to remember words that Woody Guthrie wrote as a New Year's resolution in 1943. Wake up and fight.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up.